Hello everybody, and welcome to the Diavita Fabricaster build. The reason I call this a Fabricaster is because it's a fabric top guitar. And what I'm doing here is prepping the body blank for the fabric. I'm painting it white because I didn't want the wood color coming through the fabric. If the fabric was a little too see-through, I would rather the color white come through. The first step in doing a fabric top guitar is really attaching the fabric to the blank. So what I'm doing here is using a mini paint roller to roll out some regular old Titebond wood glue. I do 2 applications to make sure that I have good, solid, even coverage of the wood glue on the body blank. Now I'm applying the fabric. I chose this fabric. I had many fabrics that I could choose from, but I chose this fabric. I fell in love with it because it's non-repeating. A lot of fabrics, the patterns on those fabrics repeat, and you can see that repetition in the space provided by the surface of a guitar. And I loved the idea that this pattern was random. Almost looks like it's been stained with a blue dye or something like that. So I'm checking to make sure there are no air bubbles. I'm using the rod of the paint roller to get all of those air bubbles out and get it as smooth as possible. This is probably a few hours later. The glue has dried, and I'm trimming away all of the excess fabric using an X-Acto knife. And I'm just running the X-Acto knife right along the edge of the wood to get as clean an edge as I possibly can. There are many ways to seal the fabric or finish the fabric on a fabric top guitar. I've come to really like using epoxy resin. I love the finish that it creates in the end, almost like a glass-like finish, and it creates depth. So in order to work with epoxy on a body blank and not have it pour over the edges, you need to create a dam. And the way I do this is by using foil tape. I find that the foil tape is extremely sticky, so it creates a really good bond with the wood, and it keeps the resin, the epoxy resin, from leaking. And it can hold up to the weight of the epoxy pushing out on the sides. It doesn't get pushed out. It doesn't buckle. It's a pretty stable barrier. So what I do is I fold the tape over. You'll see me do that about halfway, because what I've found is the foil side of the tape does not bond with the resin, and that's kind of important. I want to be able to take this tape off once the resin has cured. What I'm doing here is sealing up all of the overlapping pieces of tape to make sure that there are no gaps that the resin can seep through. And here there was a weird kind of gap that I needed to fill up. I was afraid that resin was going to find its way out, so I added one more little piece to make it nice and solid. Now, the next step is pouring the resin, but first you need to figure out how deep you want the resin to be. I wanted it to be about 1/8 of an inch. So I measured the length and width of the body blank. I converted that to centimeters, and then I converted 1/8 of an inch depth to centimeters, and I came up with how many cubic centimeters of resin I was going to need in order to fill to a depth of 1/8 of an inch. This is convenient because the cups I'm using here measure in cubic centimeters. So all I'm doing here is taking part A of the resin and adding it to a mixing cup, and I'm going to do the same thing with part B in a moment. This happens to be a 1-to-1 resin to hardener. That's the part B is hardener. A 1-to-1 ratio. So however much resin I put in is also how much hardener I'm going to put in. I'm making sure I get every little bit out because I want to make sure that my ratio of resin to hardener is as accurate as possible to ensure that it's going to harden properly. And now it's just a matter of mixing. You have to mix and mix and mix to make sure that the resin and the hardener are totally combined, and you don't have some areas where there's just resin or areas where there's just hardener. So I took out a lot of the video of me just mixing and mixing and mixing because you have to do it for at least 5 minutes, I've found. Now, all you do is pour the resin into essentially the mold that you've created, and then you have to spread it around. This will self-level from what I've been told, but it's so viscous, it moves so slowly. I just give it a head start by kind of tipping the body blank and getting the resin all into the corners. And do my best to try and get it as level as possible. What you'll notice is there are a lot of air bubbles in it. Those are all those tiny little dots. So the next step is to take a blowtorch and very quickly move the blowtorch over the surface of the resin. And what this does, and I honestly don't know why, I think maybe it expands the gases in the bubbles, it causes the bubbles to disappear. And this is a process that you have to do over and over and over again. I usually do it for about 20 minutes intermittently. I get all the bubbles to go away, I take a break, I come back, more bubbles will inevitably have shown up, and then I do another round of the blowtorching until it seems like I've gotten most of the air bubbles to go away. So this is the last time that I blowtorch the resin here. After 24 hours, the resin will be totally cured, and you can remove your dam. And that's what I'm doing here. It pulls away very easily. As I said, the foil side of the tape doesn't adhere to the resin, and although it's very sticky, it comes off the wood readily. Now, I am going to be cutting the body out using a CNC machine. And this is going to require, for reasons I'll explain later, a very flat surface. And what resin will do is kind of ride up the sides of the wall you create with the foil tape and create a lip. And that lip cannot be there when you're working with the CNC machine. So what I'm doing here is with a random orbital sander and 400 grit sandpaper, I'm trying to get that lip to go away, trying to bring it down so that it's totally flat. But I also don't want to have uneven sanding. So I am sanding the entire piece, but I'm sanding the edges more to get rid of that lip. This is a super messy process. It creates a lot of dust. From what I've been told, epoxy dust, resin dust is not something you want to be inhaling into your lungs, so you'll see that I'm wearing a respirator. And now I'm just checking to feel if there's any more lip, and there doesn't seem to be, so I'm done. It's time to cut out the body using the CNC machine. I decided to use the CNC machine, 1, because I had access to it, 2, because it's very precise, and 3, routers are scary, and if I have the opportunity to use a CNC machine, I'm going to take it. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to orient the body blank so that it's perfectly in line with the x-axis of the CNC machine. You can see that I've drawn the center line on my body blank, and now I'm using this locator pin on the CNC machine to manually orient the body so that the center line is in line with the x-axis. So I'm running the CNC arm up the center line, and if I notice that the locating pin gets off of the center line, then I know the body blank isn't square to the x-axis. So now I'm just kind of going back and forth, making small changes to the position of the body blank so that when I run the locator pin along the line, I can see if it stays on it. And when it does, I know it's in line. Once it's in line, I have to clamp it all down so it's nice and tight, and it won't shift in the process of cutting. Now what I'm doing is I'm finding the corner. I have to locate the corner, the bottom left corner of the body blank, and teach the machine where that is, because that's the 0 point. That's what it uses to calculate all of the different positions that it needs to go to. This is why I couldn't have a lip on the epoxy, because that little device that I'm using, the metal square, has to sit flush with the top of the piece. So now that I've located the corner, I've located the bottom of the piece so it knows how deep it should go, I can actually start cutting. I start all of my cuts when I'm working with epoxy. I start all of my cuts with what's called a down cut bit. And what that means is the cutting force is in a downward direction. You can also have an upcut bit where the cutting force is in an upward direction. And what I worry about is that with an upward force, it could tear the epoxy up from the wood, or it could chip. And I've had really good luck using the downcut bit to start and having really nice clean edges on the epoxy. So you're going to see the 2 pickup cavities get cut with the downcut bit. You'll notice that I'm taking some measurements, just making sure that the CNC machine is cutting to the depth that I set it for. You'll also see it start cutting the neck pocket. And then the video fast forwards to the kind of final cuts. Every time a new cut starts, you'll notice it comes to the front right corner of the screen. That's where it's testing the length of the bit, basically teaching itself how to cut to the depth that you want. I had various issues. One was almost catastrophic when it was cutting the control cavity. I had to stop, I had to re-export files, and luckily it wasn't as catastrophic as I had thought. And there you have it. In this state, the body really isn't paintable yet. The CNC machine doesn't necessarily make smooth cuts. So there are various aspects of the body that I'm going to need to smooth out. What I'm doing right now, though, is evening out the thickness of the epoxy. The epoxy is self-leveling, but one thing I forgot to do when I poured the epoxy onto the body blank is level the body blank. I should have used shims underneath to get the body level so that the epoxy would self-level and be the same thickness across the body. So I had to bring the epoxy thickness on that bottom left corner down so that it was even with the rest of the guitar. Otherwise, I feared it was going to look kind of weird. I noticed as I was sanding the body that there were various kind of nicks and scratches and dings and dents that I wanted to fill so that I could get a nice smooth surface to paint. So I'm just using a wood filler. It's a really very easy to use wood filler, almost like thick paint. And I just use a putty knife to kind of spread it across the body evenly. I put it on pretty thick and then I scrape it away as best I can. It dries really fast, although I do give it overnight just to be sure that it's as dry as possible. And then it can very easily be sanded away with a random orbital sander or even hand sanded if you didn't have one of those. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm using the random orbital sander, just going back over the wood-filled body and basically bringing it down to wood again, so that the only filler left is the filler that's filling the holes and dents and scratches. Also filled the sides of the guitar. That's where the CNC machine leaves the most uneven finish. So I sanded all that back and then used some wood filler to really kind of flatten it all out. And now I'm doing the detail work. Where the epoxy meets the fabric, or the fabric meets the wood, the fabric can kind of sometimes stick out, and I'm trying to get the fabric to be smooth, even with the level of the epoxy and the level of the wood, so that there's a smooth transition between those three substances, and so that you can't see it once everything is painted. So that's some of the detail work I was doing by hand. Here I'm just taking some of the wood filler off that went off into the neck cavity. And now I'm doing the round over. This is a brand new palm router that I purchased. I like it so much better than the full-sized router. I just feel like I can control it better. I'm using a, I believe, 3/8 inch round over bit. It cuts through the epoxy like butter. So I do this to the top, and then you'll see I'll flip it and I'll do the same round over the edges on the bottom or back. Now I'm using the random orbital sander. I also did some hand sanding as well, just to smooth out that round over. Again, the transition from epoxy to fabric and fabric to wood is a problem area, and it needs a little bit more care in terms of smoothing out. So I believe I'm using 400 grit sandpaper. One thing I forgot to mention before is I use a no-load grit because sanding epoxy, the resin particles get caught up in regular sandpaper and it becomes ineffective and or leaves scratch marks. So the no-load sandpaper is really the way to go if you're sanding epoxy. This is where I'm doing more of that detail work, the transition from epoxy to fabric and fabric to wood. And I'm just feeling for any ridges. If there's a ridge between the wood and the fabric, it means the fabric is sticking out a little bit. So I try to sand it back so that it's smooth. I recently made a vow to myself that I would drill all necessary holes in the guitar before doing any kind of finish work, because doing it in the opposite order has bitten me in the past. So what I did here was I took this StewMac Telecaster template, and luckily it lined up perfectly with the pickup cavities, and I lined it up with the center line, and I used it to locate the position of the bridge. So I just used it to drill the bridge screw holes and the string through body holes. And that's what you see me doing here. Eventually, and I did not get this on video, I use a template to finish cutting the holes for the string ferrules that go into the back of the guitar. This is historically my least favorite part of guitar building. I don't know why. Cutting the hole for the jack, it just takes so long. You have to use so much pressure. The bit gets smoking hot. But eventually I'm able to get it done. As you can kind of see here, I have masked the entire top of the guitar with blue tape. I tried to do a really good job of masking the edges too, and I'm currently priming, and then I go on to paint all of the exposed wood white. So I'm using a white primer here. This is Rust-Oleum 2X primer, and then I don't show it, but I also go in and do a 2X white paint over the primer. It was time to move on to do some neck and headstock work. You can see here I have laser cut my logo into the headstock, Dia Vita Fabricaster, and there's a little mouse mascot there. You can also see on the piece of wood underneath the neck all of the trial runs I did to try and get it the way I wanted it to. The laser printer leaves obviously a depression in the wood, and eventually what I'm going to be doing is filling that with epoxy. So what I'm doing here is using Birchwood Casey sealer and filler to seal the wood, because I'm going to be using a tint or a dye in the epoxy, and I don't want it to dye the surrounding wood, so I want to put a sealer on there so that doesn't happen. So I decide to just seal the entire neck from the headstock all the way down. to the heel because I felt like ultimately it would probably give a better finish. Because the finish I'm going to end up using is Birchwood Casey True Oil. So I apply the sealer and then I rub it back with a clean portion of the rag. Now this is the part where I'm going to mix a very small amount of epoxy. Again, it's the same epoxy I used for the body, so it's a 1-to-1 ratio, so I'm just kind of eyeing it here, which is not the best way to go, but my cups don't measure this small of an amount, so I just tried to go 50-50 with the part A and part B. And here I am adding the pigment, which is a blue pigment. I was trying to get it to be, in general, the same kind of blues that show up in the guitar body itself. And I'm just going to take some on the tongue depressor or popsicle stick and just fill in the logo. And you'll be able to see in a moment that I leave it quite proud. I want to make sure that when the epoxy shrinks a little bit, it doesn't create a depression in the lines of the logo. So I leave it quite proud. I was just getting rid of the bubbles there with the blowtorch. And this is what it looks like with the epoxy wet. So following that, I need to then sand back the hardened epoxy. And I'm using the random orbital sander and a 320 grit sandpaper. In retrospect, the 320 grit sandpaper was probably a little too coarse because as I worked my way through and started getting to the wood, I actually rubbed some of the laser cut details out. I probably should have swapped out the sandpaper for 400 grit at this point. Though I'm quite happy with the end result. I'm adding a little bit more of that sealer and filler to the headstock here, and then following this, I did the whole neck with True Oil, including the fretboard. Now that the paint has dried, I removed the blue tape from the top and all of the edge masking. And inevitably what's left is kind of a jagged line where the masking wasn't perfect. So all I'm doing here is using some dry 1000 grit sandpaper and smoothing the line created by the white paint. I'm trying to get all the jagged edges off and really kind of make it a smooth, straight line that will look better once the clear coat is put on. I'm kind of just doing periodic touch tests to see if I feel any ridge created by the paint. And if I feel a ridge, I try to knock it down with the sandpaper. Now this is my first foray into the world of airbrushing. I have quite honestly never done this before. So everything you see here is a bit of an experiment. I did do one round of airbrushing before this that came out awful. So I sanded the top back. I got rid of all of the airbrush work that I did previously. So I guess technically this is my second try at it, but I'm still very inexperienced. I'm doing my best to keep the line relatively thin, but also cover and blend into the white on the sides of the guitar, which I found to be more challenging than I expected. I found that the airbrush line around the perimeter of the top ended up being thicker than I had originally anticipated, because that was the only way I could get the coverage on the edge to be what I wanted it to be, or to have it look good. So you'll see that the airbrush on the edges here gets a little wider and wider each pass I do. But I think ultimately what I ended up with was quite nice, and I'm very happy with the end result. While the airbrush work was drying, I decided to start installing the hardware on the headstock. These are Goto tuners. I did drill pilot holes for each of these screws that you're seeing me insert here. And this was pretty straightforward. There really isn't much for me to say. They went in perfectly. The holes were perfectly sized, and I'm just making sure everything is tight. It was time to apply the clear coat. What you're seeing here is my first attempt, and my first attempt was awful. I had set my gun up to dispense way too much clear coat at once, and what ended up happening was a disaster of drips and sags that I had to sand back, none of which I taped. Eventually I figured out what was wrong, and I adjusted the gun so that future layers went on the way they were supposed to. Ultimately, I did about 6 coats of clear. It was time to start the buffing and polishing process, so the first thing I needed to do was remove my body painting jig here, and I had masked part of the neck pocket with some blue tape. It took me a little while to get this tape off. The reason I'm showing it is because I really wanted to have a nice clean edge, and I didn't want to pull up any of the clear coat. So I'm using a technique that I believe was described by Ben on one of his videos, where you pull the tape away at a 45-degree angle so that you don't pull up any of the finish or the paint. Now, I'm starting the wet sanding process here, and I've watched a lot of tutorials on how to do this, and they all say that you should start with something like 1,000 grit sandpaper, and then work your way up to 1,500 grit sandpaper and sand away all of the 1,000 grit lines, and then go up to 2,000 grit sandpaper and sand away all the 1,500 grit lines. I don't do that. I've always found that it's very difficult for me to tell when the higher grit sandpaper lines are gone. So I always start now with 2,000 grit sandpaper, and it may require a bit more sanding on my part, but I find that when I get to the polishing stage, when I'm using the buffer and polishing the guitar, I'm not left with scratch marks from the higher grit sandpapers. It's much easier for me to get that glass-like finish this way. So my process is to sand using a sanding block and water, and I sand for a bit, then I wipe away the water. I look to see if there's any more orange peel, and if there is, I continue sanding until the orange peel effect is gone. And I do this all over the body, front, back, and sides. Now what I'm using here is a car buffer. This is a car buffer with a 3-inch pad from Griot's Garage. I love this thing. I've never gotten finishes to look as good as I have using this buffer. It's very easy to move around. It's adjustable speed. I'm using a multi-purpose compound to remove the 2000 grit scratches, and the end product is just gorgeous after using this. Again, I'll buff for a little while, then I'll take a rag, I'll wipe away the compound to see if there are any remaining scratches. If there are, I continue to buff until I can get out as many of the scratches as possible. This is a little jig I created to more easily do the sides of the guitar. I've essentially made a buffing wheel out of the car buffer by C-clamping it to a sawhorse, which allows me to have both hands free to control the body. And I can get really good, fast coverage of the edges on the buffing pad this way. At this point, the body was done and ready to be wired, at which point I realized I had forgotten to drill the wire routing holes. So that's what I'm doing here. I usually like to do this kind of work before the finish work is done to avoid scratches and dings. Luckily, I was able to get this hole drilled without any problem. What I'm using here is just a traditional schematic for Telecaster wiring, since that is in fact what I'm building. There's really not much in the way of interesting technique that I use. I just have to come up with creative ways to lay out the wiring so that I don't have to hold the wire with one hand and solder with the other, because that requires 3 hands. So you'll see me bending wires and kind of balancing them or resting them on something so that I can have both of my hands free to accomplish the soldering that needs to be done. This is a prime example of that, where I put the capacitor in and kind of bend it and lay it down so that it can hold itself in position, and then I go ahead and trim the excess wire off. This is some great wire from Stumac. It's called pullback wire, where you don't have to actually remove the shielding on the outside. You just kind of slide it back and it exposes the wire inside. Now here is where I'm positioning the neck pickup. Really all I'm doing is trying to align the strings that I'm using as kind of a neck alignment strings over the magnets on the end to make sure that the string is going through as close to the center of the magnets as possible. And if that's the case, my feeling is the pickup is aligned properly with the center line on the guitar. This is how I align my neck and the bridge and all that. Typically I use string in place of actual metal guitar strings. I'll use twine or something like that. Here I'm finally attaching the controls to the pickup wires in the body. I like to lay rags on the finished body to try to avoid as much as possible scratches or solder burns or anything like that. You can see in this picture that I have shielded the control cavity. I also shielded the pickup cavities. I just didn't record me doing that. With everything wired and all of the hardware attached, it was time to string her up and see how she sounded. So I'm just attaching and tightening the strings here. And once the strings were on, that's when I added the string trees. I wanted to place the string trees in such a way that they wouldn't impede on the logo. So that's why they're, for lack of a better term, in strange places. But I did read that you can place string trees pretty much wherever you want, and it doesn't affect tone or intonation or anything like that. Here is the final product.